In this interview, Daniel Davis speaks with Professor John Mearsheimer about the Ukraine war. NATO calls for peace, but Russia rejects Ukraine in the alliance. Trump repeats Biden's mistakes, and the battlefield, not negotiations, will decide the future. In this video, we expose the truth behind the Ukraine war.
The Russians have never shown any interest in conquering territory beyond Ukraine. And furthermore, the Russians don't have any designs on conquering Western Ukraine. They would be crazy to try to conquer Western Ukraine because it's filled with ethnic Ukrainians who would put up huge resistance over the long term against a Russian occupation. So the idea that we're sort of dealing with Adolf Hitler, in May 1940, and he's poised to take France and Belgium and Holland, and then when he's done there, he's going to head east. This is just not the world that we live in. Russia is nowhere near as powerful as the Soviet Union was. Russia is not a potential hegemon in Europe. And the Russians know full well what happened when they tried to conquer Afghanistan. They know full well what happened when they occupied Eastern Europe during the Cold War. They were up to their eyeballs in alligators dealing with trouble in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Albania, Romania, Yugoslavia. Right? They're not going back into Eastern Europe. This conflict is all about NATO expansion into Ukraine. And once Ukraine is defeated and becomes a neutral state, if the West is smart, it can go a long way towards improving relations with Russia over the long term. But of course, the West won't be smart. They'll continue to poke the bear in the eye, and the bear will continue to poke the West in the eye and Romania in the eye, and we'll have trouble for as far as the eye can see.
Yeah, you talk about poke the bear in the eye, not being, I guess, thinking about reality. Why should that change now? Well, at the United Nations Security Council meeting last night, Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a warning to his Russian counterparts.
This war has to end, and we have done everything we possibly can and will continue to do everything we possibly can to bring it to an end. Very generous offers have been made. For example, a ceasefire at the current lines of contact, while all the other details on the future of the conflict could be worked out in terms of future territorial lines. The president has shown extraordinary patience in terms of not assessing additional sanctions in the hopes of having a breakthrough in this regard. And all has come to what appears to be not just a stagnant one, but an era, and we've entered a period of what appears to be potential even escalation, with the historically highest number of strikes we've seen over the last few nights and before. And now we are also watching incursions into neighboring airspace by both drones and airplanes. The president is a very patient man. He's very committed to peace, but his patience is not infinite. And as he has said repeatedly, he has before him the opportunity and the options of imposing additional economic costs on the Russian Federation if necessary in order to bring this to an end.
If necessary, to bring it to an end. And what do you make? Well, let's back up to the first part of that a little bit about his extraordinarily generous offer to allow Russia to stop fighting on the current line of contact.
He does not understand, and this is true of the vast majority of people in the foreign policy establishment in this country, that for Russia, this is an existential threat. The possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is simply unacceptable to the Russians. It is an existential threat, and they are not going to stop until Ukraine and the West are defeated, and they both accept the fact that Ukraine has to be a neutral state, number one, and it has to be disarmed to the point where it's not an offensive threat to Russia. And until you get to that point, or until you accept that point in the West, all this talk about generous terms makes no sense at all. So Rubio is, he's like a ship passing in the night with the Russians. They just, these are two sets of people who are just operating on very different planets. The Russians have demands that Rubio is simply unwilling to meet. And given that, the war is going to be settled on the battlefield, period. End of story.
Yeah, in fact, that point was made by Dmitry Peskov because he said, but he was asked, what does Russia think about these claims about 1991 borders and maybe into Russia and all that? He didn't sound like he was particularly frustrated, but then zeroed back around to the root causes.
President Trump's statements were made after communicating with Zelensky and, apparently, under the influence of the vision that Zelensky had laid out. This vision is completely contrary to our understanding of the current situation, but at the same time, we will also have the opportunity to bring our position to the American side. As for these specific statements, there is an obvious situation in the Russian economy which more than eloquently says that despite all the illegal sanctions, our economy absolutely retains its stability and predictability. The war is not aimless. The war is to ensure our security and our interests and eliminate the root cause of the conflict that exists between Russia and Ukraine, and which, in fact, exists in the field of European security in general.
Well, if they're anything on the Russian side, they are monotonous and relentless on saying the same thing year after year about what's important. So one wonders, will the message ever actually get through?
I think the answer is no. I mean, I like your rhetoric year after year. It's not month after month or week after week. It's year after year. In fact, Danny, before the war started, the Russians made it clear what their demands were. And since the war started in February of 2022, they have repeated their position ad nauseum. And it was most clearly laid out last June 14th. This is June 14th, 2024. And what Putin said then was hardly different from what he said before June 14th. And it's hardly different from what's been said since. And his lieutenants say the same thing over and over. But the West simply refuses to acknowledge what Russia's position is. And as long as that is the case, and people in Ukraine and people in the West continue to demand that the Russians accept certain provisions of an agreement that the Russians categorically reject, you're not going to get an agreement. And as we've said ad nauseum, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just don't see any evidence that anything is going to compel the Russians to give up their deeply held, emotionally held red lines about how this thing has to end because of the root causes, because of all the causes, et cetera. Or at least you would think that's the case, because it doesn't seem to be getting through. When you talk about lieutenants, just look at the U.S. side here for a minute, because now you can tell me here, there's a couple of sound bites I want to show you here from some of our side, and this may be intended for a domestic audience, because I worry if it's not for a domestic audience, if it's because we actually think this, then we have a bigger problem than I may think. Here, first of all, is Caroline Levitt talking about how frustrated President Trump has been.
He's been incredibly frustrated with President Putin and Russia, who continue to talk nice, but then we wake up every morning and in the West Wing, we're receiving reports about how Russia bombed Ukraine and they continue to kill innocent civilians. And the president is making it very clear that Russia is in a very weak position. And he's absolutely right. They are a massive country with a massive military. They are a war economy. But it's been 3.5 years. And look at how Ukraine has been able to defend itself. And so the president has said that we are going to continue selling weapons to NATO, and NATO and Ukraine can choose how to use those weapons. But the way that this weapon arrangement has now taken place under President Trump is putting America first, because we are selling these weapons to Ukraine and to NATO, and NATO is backfilling those weapons to Ukraine. So the American taxpayer is benefiting from this. That's a change and a shift in position from the Biden administration. But the president has said if Vladimir Putin wants to keep fighting, well, the president knows how to fight.
The president knows how to fight? I mean, let's start there. What the hell does that mean?
Well, very importantly, Danny, she said, and I'm sure it's true, that Trump is greatly frustrated that he has not been able to get a peace agreement, because he said that he would do that even before he got in the White House and shortly after, if he didn't get it beforehand. So I'm sure he's frustrated. And maybe he thought after the meeting in Alaska that it would be possible to get some sort of deal. So I can understand that. But you want to listen to what she said that Trump was going to do. And she basically repeated what is in the Truth Social post that we talked about at the outset of the show. She said that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are in charge. She basically said that President Trump is passing the buck to them. And furthermore, she emphasized that the Europeans are going to pay for the weaponry. We're not paying for the weaponry. This is America first. And that's completely consistent with what I said at the start of the show. And it's just more evidence that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine war. And at the same time, he's going to great lengths to protect himself when Ukraine loses.
And what do you make of the repeating there about, hey, Russia? She didn't use the term paper tiger there, but she implied it by saying, hey, Russia's been fighting for 3.5 years, and something that I think it was General Petraeus said a couple of days ago, or a few weeks rather, that no, it was Kellogg. That's right. Keith Kellogg said that Russia actually is losing because if it was winning, it would have already taken Kiev by now. So the fact that they've only taken in the last 2 years or so 1% more additional territory, that's somehow evidence that they're losing. I don't know. But if they're losing and we're going to give this weaponry for some period of time, but Russia doesn't lose, how do they worry about that? Or how do they square that one?
Don't ask me. I have no idea. I'll tell you one thing, though, for those people who think Russia's a paper tiger, and there appear to be a number of people who are thinking in those terms these days, I think that what we ought to do is fly them over to Kyiv, put them in a uniform, put them on a truck, and then send them up to the front lines. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, it's not clear they'll get to the front lines because that paper tiger is now tearing apart the lines of communication. And it's very hard for the Ukrainians to get troops from the rear up to the forward edge of the battle area. But let's assume that they get up there. Let them spend a couple weeks fighting against the Russians. And if they're still alive after a couple weeks, they can tell us whether or not they think the Russians are a paper tiger or not. And my guess is that those who survive that scenario will tell us very clearly that the Russians are not a paper tiger and that the Ukrainians are at a great disadvantage and have their hands full dealing with this massively armed steamroller that's coming at them.
Now, I may be asking you to speculate on something that you can't get inside the head of the Russians anyway to figure out, or even in the White House for that matter. But as best you can interpret from the signals that you get from multiple sources, it almost looks to me like that Trump, with this boisterous True Social post, and then the consequent actions that he is going to continue selling, apparently at the rate of $1 billion per month, at least for 10 months is the number I've seen bandied about so far. It sounds like he's just saying, this thing's not going to go on, so at least I'm going to benefit from it. So we're not going to do anything to bring it to an end. We're definitely not going to pressure the Ukraine side, which is the one area he does have some leverage, I think. But instead, it's like, we'll just sit back and make some money in between now and then, and probably just, make some more True Socials over the months and just kind of keep it going. Do you see it any differently?
No, I would just add that he's got to protect himself so that he doesn't get blamed when Ukraine loses. And he is doing that, as I explained before. And in the process, he's making money. This is a disastrous situation for the Ukrainians, as you and I have been arguing for a long time. And as you and I argued a year ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, you and I were a tag team, of course, saying that it was ridiculous to continue this war because Ukraine is just going to lose more territory and more Ukrainians will die. We've been making this argument until we're blue in the face, but nobody listens and they continue to fight. And again, President Trump telling the Ukrainians that they can capture all that territory that they lost, if anything, just encourages the Ukrainians and the Europeans to pursue this foolish policy of continuing to fight the Russians and not stopping the war, which would be in Ukraine's best interest. So as you watch this war evolve and you watch both Ukrainian and Western behavior, it more or less makes you sick to your stomach when you think of what's happening to Ukraine.